Everyone thinks World War II started when Hitler invaded Poland. That is the story we have been told for decades. But that is not the full story. Not even close. Because before the first shot was ever fired in Europe, before the air raid siren screamed across Warsaw, before the tanks rolled over borders and crushed entire nations beneath their treads, two of the most dangerous men who ever lived had already decided the fate of an entire continent. In secret, behind closed doors, with a handshake and a bottle of vodka. While the entire world was watching Berlin, terrified of what Hitler might do next, a brutal, forgotten battle was raging on the other side of the planet, on a desolate border between the Soviet Union and Japan. A battle so important, so consequential, that it may have single-handedly decided the outcome of the entire war. And yet, almost nobody talks about it. You won't find it in most textbooks. You won't see it in the movies. It has been erased from popular memory. But it happened. And everything that came after was shaped by what took place on those forgotten plains. Here is what makes this story truly terrifying. At that moment, in the summer of 1939, Hitler still believed, with absolute certainty, that Britain and France would never, ever have the courage to fight back. He had tested them before. He had taken Austria. He had taken Czechoslovakia. He had broken treaty after treaty. And every single time, the democracies had done nothing. They had protested. They had condemned. They had written strongly worded letters. But they had never actually fought back. So Hitler was convinced. The West was weak. The West was afraid. The West would never go to war over Poland. But there was one detail, one crucial detail, that nobody expected. Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, was playing both sides. While British diplomats flew to Moscow, desperately trying to build an alliance against Hitler, Stalin was secretly negotiating with Hitler himself, behind their backs. And the deal that these two tyrants were about to make would change the 20th century forever. Today, you will understand, step by step, how the entire planet collapsed into chaos in a matter of weeks, how propaganda, lies, diplomatic betrayals, and one of the most elaborate false flag operations in history pushed the world into the deadliest conflict mankind has ever known. Because the truth is, World War II did not start with an attack. It started with a pact and a lie. In June of 1939, a man named Georgy Zhukov received a phone call. It came from Moscow, and the moment he heard the voice on the other end of the line, his blood ran cold, because Zhukov was a general in the Soviet Red Army, and in Stalin's Soviet Union. Being a general did not protect you. It made you a target. At that very moment, Joseph Stalin was carrying out one of the most terrifying military purges in the history of civilization. Thousands of Soviet officers, generals, marshals, heroes of the revolution, had been arrested in the middle of the night, dragged from their homes, thrown into prison cells, tortured into signing false confessions, and then executed. Or worse, sent to the gulags, where they would be worked to death in the frozen wastelands of Siberia. Nobody was safe. Absolutely nobody. Not even the most decorated heroes of the Red Army. Zhukov had lived in constant terror for years. He kept a packed suitcase by his front door at all times, ready for the knock that he knew would come eventually, the knock of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. So when that phone call came from Moscow, Zhukov was certain This was it. His time had come. Before he boarded the train, he sat down at his desk and wrote a farewell letter to his wife. He told her he loved her. He told her to take care of the children. He believed he would never see them again. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that Zhukov could never have predicted. When he arrived at the Kremlin, trembling, expecting to be dragged away in chains, he was not arrested. He was not interrogated. He was not sent to the basement where so many of his colleagues had met their end. Instead, he was ushered into a meeting room and given a mission. A mission that would change the course of the entire Second World War. Stalin needed him to travel immediately to Mongolia, to a place so remote, so isolated, that most people in Moscow had never even heard of it. Because a silent war, a war that nobody in the West was paying any attention to, was already happening on the border between the Soviet Union and Japan. And it was about to explode. The Japanese Imperial Army had been pushing into Soviet territory for months. Small skirmishes at first, border incidents that barely made the newspapers. But now, the situation was spiraling out of control, and Stalin was terrified, not of the Japanese, but of what a war in the East would mean for his ability to deal with Hitler in the West. Because if Stalin had to fight on two fronts at the same time, the Soviet Union would be finished. And Stalin knew it. So he sent his best general. He sent Zhukov. And Zhukov, the man who had written his farewell letter just hours before, suddenly found himself not on his way to a prison camp, but on his way to a battlefield. While the eyes of the world were fixed on Europe, watching Hitler's every move, something enormous was happening on the other side of the planet. Japan and the Soviet Union were on the brink of total war, and almost nobody in the West had any idea. The Japanese military leadership was convinced that the Soviet Union was weak, pathetically weak, and honestly, they had good reason to believe this, because Stalin, in his paranoid frenzy of purges, had systematically destroyed his own military. He had executed thousands of his best commanders. He had replaced experienced generals with political loyalists who had no idea how to fight a war. The Red Army, on paper one of the largest fighting forces in the world, was in reality a hollowed-out shell, demoralized, disorganized, leaderless. The Japanese knew this. Their intelligence had been watching the purges with fascination, and they decided to test the Soviets, to push, to probe, to see how far they could go. The place they chose for this test was a river called Khalkhin Gol, a remote, desolate stretch of land on the border between Mongolia and Manchuria. There was nothing there, no cities, no resources, no strategic value, at least not in any obvious sense. Just empty steppe, stretching to the horizon in every direction. But what happened on those empty plains would change the entire trajectory of the Second World War, because the outcome of this forgotten battle would determine whether Japan would invade the Soviet Union from the east or turn its attention south toward the Pacific, toward the European colonies in Southeast Asia, toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and ultimately toward Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advanced with supreme confidence. They believed the Soviets would crumble at the first sign of resistance, that the purged and broken Red Army would retreat. But they had not counted on one thing. They had not counted on Zhukov. Zhukov arrived at the front lines and immediately understood the situation. The Japanese were well-trained, well-equipped, and supremely confident. They had been winning border skirmishes for weeks. Soviet morale was in the dirt. The officers on the ground were afraid, not just of the Japanese, but of Stalin himself. Because in Stalin's army, retreat meant execution. Failure meant death. Every officer at Khalkhin Gol knew that if they lost this idea, none whatsoever. Then, on August 20th, 1939, at dawn, the trap was sprung. More than 3 hours of devastating Soviet artillery bombardment opened the battle. The ground shook. The sky turned black with smoke. Japanese positions were hammered from every direction. And then, the tanks came. Hundreds of Soviet tanks, charging across the steppe at full speed, from the flanks, from behind, from directions the Japanese never expected. Mongolian cavalry, thousands of horsemen, swept around the Japanese positions, cutting off their retreat. The temperature on the battlefield exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce, ammunition was running low, and the Japanese found themselves surrounded. Completely, utterly surrounded. They fought with everything they had. Japanese soldiers charged Soviet tanks with nothing but swords and bayonets. Some strapped explosives to their bodies and threw themselves under the tracks. Now, here is why this battle matters so much. Here is why this forgotten clash on the Mongolian steppe changed the entire course of human history. Before Khalkhin Gol, the Japanese military had been debating 2 possible strategies for expansion. The first was called the Northern Strategy. It meant invading the Soviet Union, pushing north into Siberia, seizing the vast natural resources of the Soviet Far East. The second was called the Southern Strategy. It meant pushing south, into Southeast Asia, into the Pacific, into the territories controlled by the European colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, powers that were now distracted by the growing crisis in Europe. Before Khalkhin Gol, the Northern Strategy had powerful supporters within the Japanese military. Many generals believed that a weakened Soviet Union, crippled by Stalin's purges, would be an easy target. But after the humiliating defeat at Khalkhin Gol, after Zhukov had demonstrated that the Red Army could fight, and fight hard, the Northern Strategy was dead. Japan would never invade the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan turned south, toward the Pacific, toward the oil fields, toward the European colonies, and ultimately, toward Pearl Harbor. A forgotten battle in Mongolia led directly to the attack that brought America into the war and changed everything. While Zhukov was crushing the Japanese in Mongolia, on the other side of the world, Adolf Hitler was preparing something that would shake the foundations of civilization. Hitler was convinced, absolutely convinced, that France and Britain were finished as great powers. He had been testing them for years. In 1936, he had remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The French could have stopped him. They had the military strength. They had the legal right, but they did nothing. In 1938, he had annexed Austria, the Anschluss, a sovereign nation, swallowed whole by Nazi Germany, and the world had stood by and watched. Then came Czechoslovakia. At the Munich conference, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had literally handed Hitler a piece of another country, the Sudetenland, in exchange for a promise of peace. Chamberlain had flown back to London, waving a piece of paper, declaring he had achieved peace in our time. It was one of the greatest miscalculations in the history of diplomacy, because Hitler had no intention of stopping. Every concession, every act of appeasement, every retreat by the Western democracies only convinced Hitler of one thing: they would never fight. They were too weak, too afraid, too divided. So when Hitler turned his attention to Poland in the spring of 1939, he was certain that the pattern would repeat. He would threaten, the West would protest, and then they would back down, just like they always did. But there was a problem, a serious problem. If Hitler invaded Poland, he risked something that every German strategist feared more than anything else: a two-front war. The exact same mistake that had destroyed Imperial Germany in the First World War. Because if Hitler attacked Poland from the west, the Soviet Union could attack Germany from the east, and Germany, caught between two massive armies, would be crushed. So Hitler needed to neutralize the Soviet Union. He needed Stalin to stay out of the way. And to achieve this, Hitler was willing to make a deal with the devil himself. He would negotiate with Stalin, the same Stalin that Nazi propaganda had spent years calling the greatest enemy of civilization. The same Stalin whose communist ideology was the polar opposite of everything the Nazis claimed to believe. It didn't matter. Ideology meant nothing when survival was at stake. And so, in the summer of 1939, the two most murderous regimes on the planet began talking to each other, in secret. But Stalin was no fool. He was not being manipulated by Hitler. He was playing his own game, a game that was every bit as cold, every bit as calculated, as anything Hitler could devise, because Stalin had his own reasons for wanting a deal with Nazi Germany. First, he needed time. The purges had devastated the Red Army. His best generals were dead. His officer corps was shattered. The Soviet military was in no condition to fight a major war. Not yet. Stalin needed at least 2 or 3 years to rebuild, to train new officers, to produce new weapons, to reorganize the shattered command structure. A non-aggression pact with Hitler would buy him that time. Second, Stalin wanted territory. He wanted to reclaim the lands that the Russian Empire had lost after the First World War. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, parts of Romania. A deal with Hitler could deliver all of this, without firing a single shot. And third, there was something else. Something that most historians agree was a key factor in Stalin's thinking. Stalin was watching the Western democracies with contempt. He had seen how Britain and France had appeased Hitler at Munich. He had seen how they had abandoned Czechoslovakia. And he had concluded that the West was not a reliable ally. That if war came, Britain and France would leave the Soviet Union to fight alone. So why not let Hitler attack the West first? Let Germany and the democracies bleed each other dry. And then, when both sides were exhausted, the Soviet Union could step in and pick up the pieces. It was a cynical calculation, monstrous in its implications. But that was how Stalin thought. So while British and French diplomats were desperately trying to negotiate an alliance with Moscow, sending delegation after delegation, Stalin was stringing them along, pretending to be interested, while his real negotiations, the ones that actually mattered, were happening with Hitler's representatives, behind closed doors, in total secrecy, and the deal they were about to make would condemn an entire continent to unimaginable suffering. On August 23, 1939, the world woke up to a piece of news that seemed completely impossible. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the two foreign ministers who signed it, Hitler and Stalin. Together, the two most bitter ideological enemies on the planet had just shaken hands. The shock was seismic. In Tokyo, the Japanese government was stunned. They had been counting on Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. Now, Germany had made a deal with their enemy. Japan felt utterly betrayed. In Paris, the French government descended into panic. Their entire military strategy had been based on the assumption that if Germany attacked in the West, the Soviet Union would attack in the East, that Germany would be caught between two enemies. Now, that strategy was in ruins. In London, the British finally understood what was happening. But it was too late. Far too late. However, the public announcement of the pact was only half the story, because hidden within the agreement, buried in a secret protocol that would not be revealed to the world for decades, was something far worse. A map. On that map, Hitler and Stalin had drawn a line that divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split in half, the western half for Germany, the eastern half for the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania would fall into the Soviet sphere. Parts of Romania would go to Stalin. It was not just a non-aggression pact. It was a conspiracy, an agreement between two totalitarian dictators to carve up sovereign nations between them. Countries with millions of people. Countries with their own governments, their own cultures, their own histories, reduced to lines on a map, divided like property between two thieves. And at the signing ceremony in Moscow, after the documents were signed, Stalin raised a glass of vodka and toasted to the health of Adolf Hitler, the man who had sworn to destroy communism, the man who called Slavic peoples subhuman. None of it mattered. Power was all that mattered. And at that moment, the Second World War became inevitable. Hitler now had everything he needed. Stalin would stay out of the way. The Eastern Front was secure. There was nothing stopping him from attacking Poland. Nothing, except one small problem. He needed an excuse. Even Hitler, even a man who had shown nothing but contempt for international law, understood that he could not simply invade a neighboring country without any justification whatsoever. He needed to convince the German people that the attack was defensive, that Poland was the aggressor, that Germany was merely defending itself. So the SS, Heinrich Himmler's feared security apparatus, was ordered to create a pretext, a false flag operation, one of the most cynical, most cold-blooded deceptions in the history of warfare. The plan was simple and horrifying. SS operatives would stage a fake attack on a German radio station near the Polish border. The station was called Sender Gleiwitz. The attackers would wear Polish military uniforms. They would burst into the station, read a brief anti-German message on the air, fire some shots, and leave behind evidence that Poland had attacked Germany. But they needed bodies, real bodies, to make the scene look convincing. So they took prisoners from concentration camps, men who were already condemned to die. They dressed these prisoners in Polish uniforms, and then they killed them, shot them, and arranged their bodies around the radio station as proof of the Polish attack. The operation was given a code name, and the go signal, the phrase that would launch the entire deception, was chillingly mundane. "Grandmother has died." That was the signal. When those words were transmitted, the operation began. On the night of August 31st, 1939, SS men in Polish uniforms stormed the Gleiwitz radio station. They read their message. They fired their weapons. They left the dead bodies behind. And the next morning, Hitler stood before the German Reichstag and announced to the world that Poland had attacked Germany, that German territory had been violated, that Germany had no choice whatsoever, but to respond with force. It was a lie. Every word of it was a lie. But it worked. At 4:45 in the morning, on September 1st, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish military garrison at Westerplatte. The first shots of the Second World War thundered across the harbor, and within minutes, the full fury of the German military machine was unleashed on Poland. The Blitzkrieg had begun. Lightning War, a new kind of warfare that the world had never seen before. German tanks, panzers, smashed across the Polish border in massive armored columns, moving at speeds that seemed impossible, bypassing Polish defenses, encircling entire armies. Above them, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, dominated the skies. Polish airfields were bombed before their planes could even take off. Cities were hit with waves of dive bombers. The screaming Stukas, with their terrifying sirens, became the soundtrack of destruction. Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, Poznan. City after city came under attack, and the Polish army, brave, determined, but hopelessly outgunned and outmaneuvered, fought back with everything they had. Polish cavalry charged German tanks, not out of stupidity, as the myth would later claim, but out of sheer desperation. They knew they were outmatched, but they fought anyway, because they had no choice. The speed of the German advance shocked the entire world. Within days, the Polish military was being cut to pieces, and the world watched, paralyzed. The French military, the largest army in Western Europe, did almost nothing. They launched a token offensive into the Saar region, advanced a few kilometers, and then stopped and retreated. The British were still mobilizing, still debating, still hoping, somehow, that this could be resolved through diplomacy. And Hitler, watching all of this from Berlin, was more convinced than ever that nobody would actually declare war, that this would be another Czechoslovakia, another Austria, another bloodless victory. But this time, for once, he was wrong. On September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the invasion began, Britain issued an ultimatum: withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler ignored it. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, the British Prime Minister went on the radio and announced to the nation that Britain was at war with Germany. France followed hours later. The Second World War had officially begun, but the military campaign was only part of the story, because behind the advancing tanks, behind the panzers and the Stukas, came something far worse. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, SS units whose sole purpose was not to fight soldiers, but to murder civilians. From the very first day of the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen swept through Polish towns and villages, carrying out systematic executions. Polish intellectuals, professors, priests, politicians, anyone who could potentially lead resistance, anyone who represented Polish culture, Polish identity, Polish leadership. They were rounded up, taken to forests, to fields, to the edges of towns, and shot. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Synagogues were set on fire, with people still inside. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed in a matter of hours. This was not collateral damage. This was not the fog of war. This was deliberate, planned, organized. It was the beginning of a campaign of extermination that would eventually become the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. And it started here, in Poland. In September 1939, while Warsaw still resisted, while Polish soldiers still fought on every front. Stalin was watching, waiting, calculating. And on September 17th, 16 days after the German invasion began, the Soviet Union stabbed Poland in the back. The Red Army crossed the eastern border of Poland, with hundreds of thousands of troops. Poland, already reeling from the German onslaught in the west, now faced a second invasion from the east. The two most powerful totalitarian states on earth had crushed a sovereign nation between them, exactly as they had agreed in their secret protocol, exactly as they had planned. Poland fell, but Poland never surrendered. The Polish government fled into exile. Polish soldiers escaped to fight another day, in France, in Britain, in the skies over London during the Battle of Britain, but the country itself was divided, occupied, and subjected to a reign of terror from both sides that would last for 6 long years. World War II killed more than 70 million people. But the most terrifying part is understanding how it all began. Not with a sudden explosion, but with calculated decisions, secret agreements, diplomatic lies, propaganda, and leaders who were absolutely convinced that they controlled the future. The forgotten Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the pact between Hitler and Stalin, and the invasion of Poland were merely the first pieces of a global catastrophe. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: world wars don't start overnight. They start when leaders believe that nobody will have the courage to stop them. Because in the end, nobody imagined that September of 1939 would change the world forever.